In 1891, James Naismith nailed a peach basket to a wall in Massachusetts and created one of the greatest games in history, basketball, with no idea what this new sport would eventually become. Basketball grew, and in 1949, the two existing basketball leagues of the time merged into one, creating the NBA. Over the last 70 years, basketball has had some truly great eras and players. The 60s, with the superhuman Wilt Chamberlain and the ultimate winner Bill Russell. The 80s, with the rivalry of Magic and Bird. The 90s, when Michael Jordan became, and still is for many, including myself, the greatest player in NBA history. The 2000s, when greats like Kobe Bryant, Tim Duncan, and Shaquille O'Neal won most of their titles and became legendary. And most recently, the 2010s, when three-pointers began to completely change the way the game is played, and LeBron James became a worthy rival to Michael Jordan for the title of the GOAT. Now we're entering the 2020s, after possibly the strangest year the NBA has ever seen, and I want to look back at these decades and determine which one was really the best, which era of basketball was truly the greatest in NBA history. The 2000s decade is the greatest decade of basketball in NBA history. At least that's what I think so far. I haven't gone over the 2010s yet. I do an amount of research on each decade before I do these videos, although the 2010s happens to be the one that I already know the most about, and knowing what I already know, I do think the 2000s are going to end up on top at the end of this series. I think they're going to end up being the greatest decade in NBA history, in my opinion. And that's really fucking incredible. Alright, because what I've seen of the 2010s, and I've only seen the latter half of it, it was pretty great. The 90s were incredible. The 80s were slightly less incredible than the 90s. And the 60s were pretty dang good too. Honestly, the NBA's had a lot of great decades. And I think the 2000s is where it fucking peaked. Okay, if we're talking about talent, we're talking about storyline, we're talking about the way the game is played. It just all comes together beautifully in the NBA 2000s. And while it's not quite perfect, it's a really damn good decade. So I'm just going to get right into it. Alright, the most important thing in any decade, in my opinion, is talent. And the 2000s might be the most talented decade in NBA history. I would say it's competing with the 90s and the 2010s for that title. But it honestly might be, okay? First players that come to mind, you think the 2000s, you gotta go Shaq and Kobe. Alright, two top 10 players of all time. In the later half of the decade, you got LeBron James, Carmelo Anthony, Dwayne Wade, even Kevin Durant for part of the later part of the decade. And I can just name so many fucking players from this decade. Alright, Allen Iverson, Kevin Garnett, Dirk Nowitzki, Steve Nash. These are guys who came into their primes during this decade, and this is when they had their best seasons. Man, I've got so many players in my head, it's like, who do I actually want to name? Tracy McGrady, who is incredible, even if his career wasn't exactly what it could have been, due to all the fucking injuries. Dude was a hella choker, but he still would have been really something else if he'd stayed healthy. Yao Ming, okay? Tim Duncan, Manu Ginobili, Tony Parker. I said Steve Nash, Amari Stoudemire. Jason Kidd was fantastic. Those Pistons guys like Ben Wallace, Rasheed Wallace, and Chauncey Billups. What a fucking massive amount of talent in this decade. And I know I'm forgetting people. Okay, Paul Pierce, Ray Allen. I know I'm forgetting people. Chris Bosh. I'm just gonna stop there because I'm probably gonna end up saying a couple more names by the end of this video. But there is so much freaking talent in this decade. Dwight Howard towards the end of it too. Just a lot of great players. And while not all of them enjoyed their entire peak during this decade, Shaq, for instance, was kind of shit by the end of it. And like LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, they didn't come in until almost halfway through the decade. There were a lot of players who at least experienced some of their prime during this decade. Alright, there was just so much competition. And this decade was really fantastic in the way that I'd say the talent in terms of position was really diverse, because if you look at the 2010s, the center position is really weak, and I'm going to go over that more in my 2010s video, probably in a couple days to a week from now. And if you look at the 90s, or not as much the 90s, but prior to the 90s, the competition at the guard spots were much weaker. It was a lot of forwards and centers. Even in the 80s, when Magic Johnson was arguably the second best player, the dude was really a point forward, you know? He wasn't a proper point guard in the way that the dude was like 6'3". Not to say, like, he was clearly a point guard, but he was very untraditional, you know? The 2000s is where it was really all over the place. You had Shaquille O'Neal, who was maybe the most dominant player ever at his peak in 2000, 2001. And you also had guys like Kobe and Allen Iverson, specifically Allen Iverson, who was a very short player who, you know, despite his stature, he was able to be a fucking beast, alright? I think he's overrated, but nevertheless, dude was a fucking beast in his prime. I gotta stop giving my opinions on these random players, alright? It's not what this video is about, alright? This video is about how good this fucking decade was, and it was really good. Power forwards were at their peak during this decade. Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, and Dirk Nowitzki were incredible. There were a lot of great point guards. Chris Paul, Jason Kidd, Steve Nash. Alright? You had the forwards with LeBron, Melo, Kobe, if you're going to count a guard as a forward. I don't really know what you want to say. Dwayne Wade. A lot of these, like, middling players. It was just very spread out. And there wasn't one clear position just kind of dominating the decade the way that I would say point guards as a whole kind of, or perimeter players kind of dominated the 2010s, or centers really dominated the 90s and before then. Despite Michael Jordan, the 90s really were a centers decade with guys like Hakeem and Ewing and David Robinson, alright? It was very spread out in the 2000s, and it was fantastic. Looking at storylines for this decade, the Lakers three-peat obviously was incredible. As someone who's not a Lakers fan, it wasn't great for me because I don't like the Lakers, but the most popular team being the most successful team in the NBA, that's always good, okay? So that was fantastic, and then them getting upset by the Pistons. The Spurs were fantastic throughout the decade. The West was just ridiculously tough, alright? It was just a tough-ass conference. Kobe winning in 2010 specifically after losing in 2008 was absolutely incredible. LeBron James's rise in the late part of the decade, including when he made the finals or when he won his first MVP in 2009. The big three coming together on the Celtics. There was so much stuff that happened, okay? Freaking excellent storylines going on in this decade. Especially a lot of stuff revolving around Kobe. It was a competitive MVPs through this decade. I don't believe any player won more than 2 MVPs in the decade, which is pretty great. It's kind of crazy to look back at some of these players who were so talented and only had 1 MVP. You look at Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe Bryant, each only had 1 MVP to their name. Dirk Nowitzki only has 1 MVP. Kevin Garnett, 1 MVP. How do you get players this ridiculously talented with 1 MVP? It's because this decade was fucking stacked. Okay? And some of the other MVPs were just incredible. Kevin Garnett has one of the most underrated MVP seasons ever. Ridiculous season for that dude. Allen Iverson was incredible in 2001. It was the only year he really lived up to his potential, unfortunately. LeBron's MVP at the end of the decade was amazing. Kobe finally getting his. Dirk Nowitzki had a hilariously embarrassing MVP where he won it and then lost in the first round. Alright, it was just fantastic. Shaq, arguably the best MVP of all time. I'm not saying it is, but not saying it isn't necessarily either. Just some fantastic fucking storylines in this decade. The rivalries, alright, Lakers-Celtics coming back. Heat and Mavs, although that one kinda really capped off in 2011, so it's a different decade. But still, just absolutely incredible, okay? Specifically the rivalries in the West. And that's where you get one of the best parts and one of the worst parts about this decade is the Western Conference was fucking stacked. Okay? You're looking at so many incredibly talented teams. The competition was ridiculous in this decade. Alright? The Lakers, they destroyed competition in 2001, but in 2002, many people still think they should have lost to the Kings, and the NBA fucked them over. And in 2000, they really could have lost to the Blazers also, okay? They came pretty close to losing. The Spurs had a tough road. There was never a year where the Spurs just clearly dominated everyone else. 2003, they only beat the Lakers because Tim Duncan had a just insanely good season. All right, the Mavs had a very tough road. There's a reason they only made the finals once. The Suns, despite having Steve Nash win 2 MVPs in this decade, they never made the finals during the decade, constantly getting stopped by teams like the Mavs, the Spurs, the Lakers. There was just so much talent. There's so many other little teams. The main ones in the West are obviously the Lakers, the Spurs, the Mavs, and the Suns, I would say. But there's so many other smaller teams. The Blazers were amazing at the start of the decade, along with the Kings. Get these teams. The Jazz were pretty good from time to time. The Nuggets were great at the end of the decade. There was just so much talent spread out throughout the Western Conference. And that does lead me to the one real issue with the decade, I would say. And that's that the Eastern Conference was weak as hell. However, it wasn't as bad as some people may be led to believe. Like, I would say the worst Eastern Conference in the 2010s is definitely worse than in the 2000s. Alright? Because in the 2000s, you look at the teams coming out of the East. You got Reggie Miller's Pacers, which weren't very good, but they still did take the Lakers to 6 games. They weren't like trash or anything. And also, the Pacers team in general could have been phenomenal if not for Malice in the Palace. Like, that was a championship level team that got destroyed by some dumbass fans and some players who couldn't keep it in their pants. Alright? I don't know why I said couldn't keep it in their pants. It's not like they were fucking the fans. What the fuck am I saying? They couldn't keep their anger in check. I don't know why I tried to use that metaphor. Anyway, Allen Iverson, 2001 with the Sixers. Kind of an underrated team. One of the reasons I think AI is overrated. That team was not trash or anything, alright? Vince Carter with the Raptors was alright. T-Mac, another player I didn't mention. Freaking fantastic. It's really a shame injury stole his career. He was great on the Magic, alright? The Nets made the finals twice, and those Nets teams have become kind of underrated. Jason Kidd is a freaking beast, okay? Dude's kind of underrated all time, in my opinion. Jason Kidd was an amazing player. The Detroit Pistons, who are honestly some of the best teams of all time, those 2004-2005 Pistons with Ben Wallace and Chauncey Billups, those teams were ridiculous. No true superstar traditionally, but ridiculously talented teams nevertheless. Alright? Then you got the Heat with Dwayne Wade, who made it there. They were incredible. Alright, the Celtics later, those LeBron teams that LeBron took to 60-plus win seasons despite sucking ass. Alright, the Big Three Celtics, they were great. It was just, the talent wasn't amazing, and it fluctuated a lot. There were no real dynasties in the East, even if the Pistons came kind of close by making the finals twice and actually winning one of those finals. But, it wasn't terrible either. I would say that's significantly better than LeBron just making the finals 9 straight times like he did in the 2010s, because at least it's kind of moving around. It's talented enough that there's several talented teams competing every year. You don't know who's going to come out of the East, and you really didn't know who was going to come out of the West either. It's easy to look back and be like, oh, the Lakers dominated the decade, but at the time, 2001, like I was saying, it's the only year the Lakers really clearly just bulldozed everyone else. It was a fucking dogfight in the West every year other than 2001. Alright, the Spurs were always competing, the Mavs. Like I said, competition was at an all-time high, and it just ended up coming out where Kobe got 5 titles. Kobe could have very easily ended up with 2 or 3 titles in this decade if a couple calls and a couple plays go differently for the Lakers. He could have very easily not made the finals as many times as he did, okay? Lakers might have only made the finals 2 or 3 times, honestly. Really could have happened. It was just incredible, the competition. And the playstyle of the decade is the last thing. I think the 2000s had the best playstyle so far in NBA history, because it was a mix of the center position was not dead, the big man was not dead, okay? Even if a lot of them were power forwards, Tim Duncan was kind of a center, but only sometimes. Shaq was a beast in the early decade, alright? But then you got guys like Dirk Nowitzki moving out of the perimeter. Kevin Garnett could kind of do everything, okay? You got perimeter players like Kobe, like Allen Iverson, who were fantastic at driving and at the mid-range. Then the three-pointer really started to come along in this decade, though. This is where guys like Ray Allen started shooting threes a ton and really started to popularize it. It obviously wasn't even close to what Steph Curry would do to it later. However, this is where threes became a legit thing that all teams were doing several of a game, and it really started to space out the floor and started to really diversify the talent in the NBA. Players weren't just having to get into the paint anymore. There was three-level scoring, was very consistent throughout the league at this time. All right, this is where the NBA really got good, and defense was probably close to its peak now because there was no hand checking, but the refs weren't quite as soft as they would become in the next decade. So therefore, it was some pretty good defense all around, where perimeter defense was maybe a little weaker than it was before, but this made players more talented. You got guys like Kobe Bryant who were entertaining to watch on defense, guys like Ben Wallace who were just so ridiculous despite their size in the paint. Alright, Ben Wallace is honestly kind of the first small ball center. The dude was insane. He was like 6'9" and he was stopping Shaq. Incredible. Of course, you still had your traditional big men, Tim Duncan and Kevin Garnett, fucking ridiculous players, but they started to emphasize versatility with guys like Kevin Garnett. It was just so incredible. LeBron was huge for this too later in the decade. You know, Dwayne Wade was a great defensive player. It was just really good how types of offense and defense were very spread out, were very versatile, and everything was very... I really gotta start scripting these. Everything was very, it was very balanced, you know? There wasn't just one thing dominating everyone. It wasn't just mid-rangers anymore. It wasn't just centers posting up. And it wasn't just threes like it tends to be these days. It was a very balanced attack on all levels of the game. And that made it insanely good to watch. So, because of that, because of the reasons I have said, okay? Talent, storyline, competition, playstyle. Storyline is definitely the least biggest factor. The least biggest factor? What the fuck am I saying? Is definitely the least... I almost said the least affecting factor there, but I feel like that's not right either. You know what I'm trying to say, okay? Storyline wasn't huge, even though it definitely was existent. You know, there was some good storylines, but there wasn't anything absolutely amazing for the most part, besides maybe Kobe 2010, and that's 2010's decade, so we're not going to count that. Storyline was a little weak, alright? Competition in the East wasn't great, but the talent in the league was absolutely phenomenal, and the ways teams played were just... It was so balanced that it really maximized entertainment, in my opinion. I think this was probably the most entertaining decade to watch, just from the film I've seen, and the way that defense was still very strong, and there were enough threes to keep it interesting, but it wasn't just nothing but threes. It was just fantastic basketball being played, and I really hope we find a way to get closer to the 2000s as we move forward, and maybe even surpass it. But we have not gotten to the 2020s yet. We've still got to go through the 2010s, so that's what we will be covering in the next video in this series. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Check out some other content. I've got several other videos in this series, alright? Did why the 70s sucked, and I've already covered the 60s, 80s, and 90s. So if you enjoyed this video, definitely check those ones out. And check out some other content on my channel too, because, you know, I've got some stuff other than this series also. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed.